Hi, guys, it's Mrs. Shannon, and we are going to start today's lecture, which is on the cycles of matter. Now, matter is recycled. That means it can be used again in an ecosystem. That is a little bit different than energy. So far, we've been using arrows to show how energy flows in an ecosystem, but it cannot actually be recycled and used again. It's changed into a completely different form, and it changes from one place to another, but it's not recycled. Today, though, we're going to shift our thinking and start looking at matter. Now, what is a biogeochemical cycle? That is a fancy word. And basically, a biogeochemical cycle has a few words in it. It has bio meaning life, geo meaning earth, and chemical meaning, well, chemicals. And so you have a cycle, goes in a circle, that deals with life, earth, and chemicals, or chemistry, I should say. It's the movement of a particular chemical through the biotic and abiotic parts of an ecosystem. And hopefully you remember that biotic refers through the living, and abiotic refers to the non-living parts of the biosphere. And down here, over here on the side, is actually a little picture showing some of the major elements, some of the major types of chemicals, I should say for now, that actually cycle through the biosphere. Now, we're going to talk in a minute about something called schnapps, but before we do, we need to remember that matter is anything that takes up space and has mass. Now, when you get into ICP or physics, you'll talk a little bit more about what this mass means, but for now, it takes up substance, and it's tangible, it can be touched. Even though it's quite small, it takes up an area of space. All matter is made up of elements. The elements can be found on the periodic table. There are a few more that are being found, but this is pretty much what we have, and you've probably seen this in middle school. We have some of the gases over here. Some of the gases over here. Some of the popular ones: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and that's actually what we're going to be focusing on, because here in biology we study living things, and 96% of living organisms are made of 6 different elements. That's it. 96% of the mass of living organisms are made of these following elements. We have carbon. Carbon's known to be a great builder molecule. It is like the best Lego to use when you're constructing your building, because it can connect to everything in a stable manner, and all other atoms like to bond to it. And it's found in many molecules in the body. We'll actually be talking about something called macromolecules or biomolecules, which revolve around carbon in the next couple of weeks. And when you go on to college, there's actual entire chemistry classes just devoted to carbon chemistry. The next one is hydrogen. Hydrogen, obviously, it's an H2O, so it's important there. It's also important in energy, and hydrogen is this cool little ion, actually, that is very high energy. And when we talk about ATP later on, and we talk about bonding, we'll see how the energy comes into place, but it carries a lot of energy with it. Nitrogen are found in what's called amino acids. These are part of those organic molecules, those macromolecules we'll be talking about. And we'll be talking about, protein workers. And they make up proteins, the backbone of proteins. Oxygen, again, H2O, it's found in water. And we just finished talking about respiration. Oxygen is a main component of respiration. We know that cells need energy, and in order to get that energy, they need to undergo cellular respiration, which requires oxygen. Phosphorus, which is found in DNA molecules. You probably remember that term from middle school. And sulfur. Sulfur is also an amino acids like nitrogen, and they are the protein power. Without sulfur, we wouldn't have these huge, big, complex proteins to be able to carry out all these things in your body. And so when we look at it in percentage of total body weight, again, over 96.2% of your body weight is made out of these elements, with oxygen being the most, followed by carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. Now, we remember this by schnapps. Now, sulfur, you notice, is really kind of low, and so is phosphorus. There's actually more calcium. You've probably heard about that in terms of bones. But we're going to we say schnapps because phosphorus and sulfur, they do still play an important role in these macromolecules we'll be looking at later. Now, we're going to look at the cycling of a few of these today. Carbon, as well as the water cycle, which is hydrogen and oxygen, and nitrogen. So we're going to start with carbon since that's the cool master builder here. Carbon-based organic molecules are essential to all organisms. In fact, if you hear the word organic, it means it has carbon in it. The carbon cycle moves carbon dioxide. Now the CO2 stands for carbon dioxide. Most often you see the two little, but just the way that the formatting was on here, it's large. But CO2 comes from the atmosphere. Remember, we just talked about respiration. It moves through the food web and it can actually return back to the atmosphere. Remember that CO2 is taken up via photosynthesis. And what organisms do that? Well, these little dudes over here, the producers do. And then these producers take the carbon dioxide and they store it in glucose molecules and carbohydrates. These animals then go ahead and eat it and they return the carbon dioxide via respiration. Now, living things aren't the only things that have a role in carbon dioxide. Volcanoes and the burning of fossil fuels from factories, they contribute to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as well. So here you go. You have your carbon dioxide coming in through photosynthesis. Thank you, producers. Okay, stored in the glucose molecules, eaten by the consumers. Now the consumers are taking in those glucose, they take in the oxygen, but in the process, they're going to release that carbon dioxide. It will be toxic for these living things if it builds up inside the body. So they exhale them, they get rid of that, and it goes back into the atmosphere where it can be taken in again. And then we have these little, these other things that also contribute the burning of the fossil fuels. Now, we think of producers as being on the plants. However, there's these things called phytoplankton in the ocean. They also use photosynthesis, and they are also considered producers. They're just really tiny plant-like organisms that float around on top of the oceans. Also, as things die, they decompose, and when these organisms decompose, some of the carbon is broken down and released that way too. So that's the carbon cycle. Now we're going to focus on the water cycle. So water cycle, we have hydrogen and oxygen going on, and we're focusing on those other two elements. Now water is essential to all organisms. After all, we have bodies made mostly of water. The water cycle is often called the hydrologic cycle. Hydro meaning water. That's another prefix you should know. If you don't have this in your prefix chart, please add it to it. Again, it's a cycle, so that means it's a circular pathway of Earth. Water moves by the processes of evaporation, transpiration, condensation, precipitation, and it can also move through the surface and groundwater. And on the next slide, I'll show you a bigger picture of this so we can see it. Now, 97% of the biosphere's water is contained in the ocean. So a lot of this is happening over the ocean, not even over the mainlands. However, 2% is in glaciers and polar ice cap, only 1% in the lakes, rivers, and groundwater that's found around here. Now here you can see the water cycle. Again, we have the precipitation coming down as in rain or snow, but either way, precipitation is when water comes down to the ground. If it moves through the soil, we call that percolating. If you think about it, you might have heard that your parents used to have to percolate their coffee, or the coffee is percolating. That means the water goes through the grounds of the coffee, just like the water goes through the ground here. Now, from the ground, it can run off. It can keep percolating, moving through the soil until it gets to a bigger body of water. If it's up towards the land, if water's up towards the land, it didn't go all the way down through the soil, it's still on the land. It can actually head back up to the atmosphere through transpiration. Transpiration is when it's coming off of when it's coming from a solid state here up into the gas. Sorry, I just said that wrong. From the from the liquid state up into the gas phase. And then also evaporation if it's coming off of a body of water up into the gas phase again. And then thanks to the solar energy and the climate and the wind up here, we're going to have different ways that it can precipitate down in the way of rain and in the way of snow. Okay. The third cycle we're going to talk about is the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is a component of amino acids. This is a term you're probably not familiar with, but you will become much more familiar with it this semester and next. Amino acids are the building block of proteins. They're also found in nucleic acids found in DNA. Now, the nitrogen cycle is mostly taking place underground, okay, in the soil. And so you hear about terms like nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation is when bacteria, or sometimes the roots in plants, have bacteria on them. Sometimes they're just loose in soil. They convert nitrogen into ammonia. Ammonia you may feel like is poisonous and it's bad for you, but in fact, ammonia can be a usable form of nitrogen through this process. The ammonia is released into soil and it's transformed into ammonium. Now, nitrifying bacteria change the ammonium into nitrate. And the decomposition returns the nitrogen to the ground. Basically, what's going on here, decomposition. Please do note that decomposition, we're talking decomposition, so we have our decomposers here. So in a nutshell, we have our nitrogen in the atmosphere. Nitrogen fixing bacteria in the soil and in the roots here are going to change this free nitrogen into a form that is usable in the ground. The decomposers are then able to use it. Okay, so here we go into NH3, which is ammonia. We're changing it into ammonium. And now the bacteria is able to break it down, release it into a nitrate. The nitrate is able to be used by the plants, and it makes its way back up. Sounds really complicated. What you really need to take away from here is that nitrogen still is a cycle. Nitrogen takes place mostly in the ground. Nitrogen involves decomposers, and a couple of primary decomposers that we're looking at are bacteria and fungus. So those are our primary bacteria, or the primary decomposers that we're going to be looking at. Okay. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about human influences in the ecosystem later on, but just when we're talking about cycles of matter, it's important to note that a couple of things that we do actually affect these different cycles. When we talk about water withdrawal from lakes and streams, we're going to be changing the balance of that cycle for the water cycle. When we're clear-cutting vegetation, now think about this, vegetation means plants. Plants are producers. And so what are we going to be affecting? We're going to be affecting the carbon cycle there, okay? We're going to be affecting the photosynthesis, respiration, and the food web. When we're filling wetlands, when we're burning fossil fuels, remember, if you see fossil fuels, just think carbon dioxide for the time being, because they're really good emitters, or I shouldn't say good as in a positive way, but high emitters of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and it puts too much carbon dioxide. Agriculture is going to just shift the balance. Whoops, I don't know what's going on with my screen. Shift the balance of the carbon cycle. And then runoff of animal wastes, fertilizer, and sewage treatment is really going to affect the nitrogen cycle. We're going to talk a little bit more in the future about how fossil fuels and the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere contributes to something called the greenhouse effect. So expect to hear a little bit more of that. Also, there are other cycles that we did not address, such as the phosphorus cycle. I just covered 3 of the main ones. So if you hear about phosphorus cycle, know that it still goes through living and non-living things, and it continues to be recycled throughout. As with all of the cycles, they do. They are recycled. The matter is able to be used again. It's just transferred into a different form. Now, if you have any questions, please message me or post in discussion on Canvas. So what's next? Right now, you should make sure that your notes are filled in. If they're not, you're going to want to rewatch, rewind, go back to where you need to. You want to identify important vocabulary. Depending on the assignment, you're either going to be listing these vocabulary terms or highlighting them in the notes. In the margins, you're going to be writing questions that come up while you're watching this video. So what questions do you have? Did you do this while you were watching the video? And finally, write a statement of importance or a summary. What was the big idea? What's the takeaway message here? If you did not do any of these steps, you may need to rewatch it. Also, as it gets closer to test time, please come back and rewatch to help review all the important facts. I hope this is helpful, and I will talk to you in class.